Okay, we've been studying the book of First Corinthians together over the last few weeks. And I'm talking about how God can use us to build up his church. And this morning, we're going to look at First Corinthians chapter 9. So go ahead and turn there in your Bibles. First Corinthians chapter 9. Before we take a look at that, I want to present you with a question. All right. Question is, when should we fight for our rights versus laying down our rights? And you see the title of this morning's sermon is Laying Down Our Rights? Question mark. All right, it's a question. When should we lay down our rights? And let me just give you a few hypothetical situations. Maybe you could judge for yourself. Should this person lay down the rights or take up their rights? Okay, every day Mary cooks for her husband Jim, and Jim is responsible for doing the dishes. But on this night, it's already 10 o'clock, and Jim still hasn't done the dishes yet. Mary knows Jim had a long day and is pretty tired. And so she has a choice. Should she hold Jim to his commitment to wash the dishes, or should she lay down her rights and do the dishes for him? What do you think? What should she do? Okay, here's another one. There's a couple of them here. Phil went to a restaurant and ordered a steak, a very expensive restaurant, but it was very overcooked and dry. And so he thought about it. Should I send back the steak and get a new one? But as he saw his waitress coming around, she looked very tired and overworked. And so he had a decision. Should he take up his right to get a new steak, well cooked, or to lay down his rights? Okay, here's another one. Fred has a neighbor who has loud house parties every weekend, and the noise keeps him up till late at night. He spoke into his neighbor, asked him to stop or to quiet down, but the neighbor doesn't do anything. What should Fred do? Should he demand his neighbors respect his quiet time, maybe even call the police? Or should he choose to lay down his rights and allow his neighbor to do what he wants? What do you guys think? Here's another one. Jan is a Sunday school teacher with a growing class of young adults. When their church started a new construction project on a new building, the pastor promised that she could have a new classroom for her class that would be much bigger. But when the building was done, a smaller class of older adults claimed the classroom for themselves and refused to give it up. What should Jan do? Should she demand the classroom she was promised, or should she lay down her rights? Two more. When Ted got a new job at a bustling startup, he made it clear to his boss that he could not work on Sundays because he's a Christian and that was his day of worship. However, when things got busier at work and a project deadline was coming up, his boss asked him to work on the weekend to get his project finished, Saturday and Sunday. Should Ted stand up for his rights to worship God freely, or should he lay down his rights to help his boss finish the project? Samir, last one. Samir lives in a country where Christians are treated as second-class citizens and are not able to worship freely. They're not able to get certain jobs or practice the freedom of worship. Samir hears that there is a public protest coming up to demand equal rights for Christians to be able to worship God freely. Should Samir be part of this protest to demand his rights, or should he lay down his rights in respect of the government? All right, some tough choices here, right? I don't think any of them are very, maybe the first few, maybe one or two are an easy answer, but some of them are kind of difficult, right? What is the right thing to do in this situation? Sometimes we want to stand up for what we believe is right, but other times we may want to lay down our rights for maybe a greater purpose. How do we know when to take a stand and when to lay down our rights? How do we know when we should fight for what is good versus letting others have their preference? In this morning's passage, we see Paul continuing to address an issue that arose in the Corinthian church. And we've been looking how this church in Corinth was a church going through a lot of turmoil and conflict. Maybe this church was even kind of on the verge of breaking down. And so Paul's writing this letter to provide guidance for the church of how they can focus on the Lord and learn to work together and stand in God's truth. And we talked about how Paul addressed this issue of the church being divided by people taking different sides and following different leaders, which is causing factions to form in the church. We talked about how Paul addressed a sin that was allowed to go on in the church. And last week we talked about this issue of this controversial topic that had arisen in the church that people were, again, being divided on, taking different sides on, of whether Christians should be able to eat meat that was sacrificed to idols but sold in the marketplace. And we talked about how Paul gave an argument that, it's okay to eat this meat, but at the same time, maybe these Christians should withhold from eating it if it wounds the conscience of other believers. Right? And so he actually called them to respect their brothers and sisters and to lay down their right to eat that meat if it would cause their brothers and sisters to stumble. Some of you guys might remember that if you heard last week. And this morning's passage kind of continues along that same idea, but Paul's actually using himself as an illustration here and building up sort of a similar but further argument for this idea of laying down our rights. So let's read together 1 Corinthians chapter 9, starting from verse 1. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 1. Paul says, "Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are you not the result of my work in the Lord? Even though I may not be an apostle to others, surely I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me. Don't we have a right to food and drink? Don't we have a right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas? Or is it only I and Barnabas who lack the right to not work for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat its grapes? Who tends a flock and does not drink the milk? Do I say this merely on human authority? Doesn't the law say the same thing? For it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox when it is treading out the grain. Is it about oxen that God is concerned? Surely he says this for us, doesn't he? Yes, this was written for us, because whoever plows and threshes should be able to do so in the hope of sharing in the harvest. If we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap material harvest from you? Okay, so we see here in this situation, Paul is kind of developing an argument here because people are criticizing Paul and questioning his authority as an apostle of God. Right? They're maybe saying, Paul, you consider yourself apostle, but you never walked with Jesus like the other apostles, like Peter, James, and John. And they're kind of questioning this issue of whether Paul should be allowed to receive support from the church, financial support, or whether he should have to work to support himself in ministry. And Paul's argument here is pretty interesting. He says, you should know that I'm an apostle because I'm the one that started your church, right? The church in Corinth was planted by Paul, and so he is basically like their church father. The church would not be there without Paul. And yet they're questioning his authority as an apostle and as a leader. And you can kind of sense Paul's sort of frustration here, right? They're not really, honoring him as a leader. And he goes on to say is it inappropriate for me to stand up for my rights, to receive material support from the church, to be accompanied by a wife, whether his wife or other apostles, or to be able to be supported without having to work himself? And so he uses a couple illustrations here. Imagine you're a farmer or a shepherd. Wouldn't it be obvious for you to, as a farmer, being able to eat your own crops? Of course, right? Or if you are a shepherd, to enjoy the meat or the milk from your crop, from your flocks? Obviously, yes. Even an ox gets to eat the grain while it is working. And so Paul's saying that church leaders should be able to receive from the church for the ministry that they're doing to serve the Lord. And I think Paul's making a very strong argument here. It's not wrong for Paul to receive money and support, to continue to minister to them and to spread the gospel. Okay, so let's read on in verse 12. If others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have all the more? But we did not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. But we did not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with Don't you know that those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple, and that those who serve at the altar share in what is offered at the altar? In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. But I have not used any of these rights. Am I not writing this in the hope that you will do such things for me? For I'd rather die than allow anyone to deprive me of this boast. For when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, since I am compelled to preach. Woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. If I preach voluntarily, I have a reward. If not voluntarily, I'm simply discharging the trust committed to me. What then is my reward? Just this, that in preaching the gospel I may offer it free of charge, and so not make full use of my rights as a preacher of the gospel. All right, so here Paul is saying that even though I have a right to be paid and to be receiving support for my ministry, I've made the conscious choice not to take that privilege. And he says, in fact, I choose to lay down my rights for the sake of the gospel. Right? Even though in every sense Paul deserves to be supported, he deserves to have that right, he's willing to lay it down. And why is that? Right? Paul wouldn't have to go through all this hardship of trying to work and raise money and, take a lot of time that he could be using to minister. But he chooses to go through all that for the sake of not having people accuse him of taking advantage of his position. Right? Some people will say, well, Paul, maybe you're just serving to make money for yourself. Or Paul, maybe you're just too lazy to work a real job, and that's why you're a preacher. Or maybe they would question his motives or his character for receiving money and support for doing ministry. But Paul says, because of all that, I willingly choose to lay down my right for the sake of the gospel message, right? So that my preaching, my ministry will not be diluted by questions of my own personal integrity. And so we have an interesting challenge here for us. Okay, are there situations where God calls us to lay down our rights for a greater purpose, or because we are simply following Jesus and what he's called us to do? And I think about in our relationships, right? In our relationships, there may be times that God calls you in your relationships with your other community or family to lay down your right. Okay, God calls us to let go of anger, even when we have a right to hold on to a grudge, right? To lay down our rights to get revenge on that person. God calls us to choose patience when we have the right to be angry with other people. Okay, God calls us to lay down our rights of having our own needs, to serve others, and to put their needs before our own. Why? We lay down our rights to serve because God calls us to be servants. We lay down our rights to our own comfort, to be a blessing to other people, because it can open their hearts to God's message. Right? So in our relationships, God can often call us to lay down our rights. We talked about a few weeks ago about laying down our freedoms for the sake of our brothers and sisters. Right? Paul says that we are called to be free, but we're not used to use that freedom to indulge ourselves, but to serve one another. And so even if we have personal conviction that we are free to do certain things that people may disagree with, the Bible tells us that we should lay down those rights to respect other people who may be hindered by our freedom. How about in the church? Are there times where God calls us to lay down our rights? Sometimes we may need to yield our preferences, our personal opinions for the sake of the unity of the church. Maybe some of us have a right to our opinions or convictions about how the church is run, maybe what kind of music is played, how the money is being spent, but our opinions could be different from other people, maybe even the majority of the church. And so God calls us to lay down our rights for the sake of the greater good of the church body. Or how about in our witness to other people? Okay, the Bible calls us to sometimes lay aside our personal comforts and conveniences if it helps us connect with someone who is far from God. It may call us to go into places where we're out of our comfort zones, to be inconvenienced, to give up our time and energy, and to lay down our rights for the opportunity to let others see Christ in us. Even sometimes receiving mistreatment or persecution for the sake of the gospel being conveyed through our lives. So God says there are times where you're called to lay down your rights rather than standing up for what you deserve. Okay, let's read on in verse 19. Paul says, "Though I am free and belong to no one, I've made myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having law I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but I am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Okay, so here Paul goes even a step further. He doesn't say, I'm just going to lay down my rights, but he says, I'm going to make myself a slave to everyone. Right? Have you guys ever said that to God? God, I want to be a slave to everybody. Right? Why? Why is Paul willing to lay down his rights and become a slave? Why? Because he has a greater purpose in mind, and that is for the sake of the gospel. I do this all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in his blessings. And so Paul is saying that to reach those who are like those under the law, maybe those who are more used to the Jewish tradition and living like the Jews, he models his life in that way. Right? He respects their customs, maybe what they choose to eat or not eat, or how they choose to follow the law in their lives. And so when Paul is around the Jews, he changes his actions to not present an obstacle to the gospel towards them. But when Paul is with the Gentiles, he says he lives as one outside the law. He doesn't live as under the law as Jews do. He doesn't force the Gentiles to do the same. He may even go outside the boundaries of what he is comfortable with. In fact, many Jews would not associate with Gentile Christians, but Paul is able to cross those boundaries for the sake of the gospel, right? To go beyond maybe what is comfortable for him, to live like those without the law. Right? And so Paul is not saying here that we should, have a lot of different identities or be different around different people. He's not saying that we should compromise the truth or even sin to fit in with other people, but he's saying that we're willing to lay down our rights to our comfort and even sometimes our own identity for the sake of opening the door for the gospel message. Okay, for adapting our lives to prevent barriers to people hearing the truth and knowing the truth of the gospel. I heard a pastor who kind of shared about how he learned this in his own life. And this pastor moved into a new neighborhood, and he had some neighbors who would get together every Saturday. And this one neighbor was really proud of his homemade margaritas. And so every Saturday, this neighbor would invite a bunch of other guys. They'd come over, and he would make these homemade margaritas. And he would brag, these are the best margaritas in the whole city. Right? And people would come and just hang out, and they would play cards, play poker, and drink margaritas. And this pastor would kind of, look at his neighbors and say, that's not really a very good lifestyle to be living, to be drinking and gambling in the middle of, Saturday afternoon. But he said, I'll pray for them. I'll pray for them. So months and months passed, and he prayed for his neighbors. And he just kept praying for them and asking God to change them and for them to hear the gospel. And then one day, one of his church members came to him and asked him, how's it going sharing the gospel with your neighbors? And the pastor said, well, there's been no progress, but I've been praying for them. And so this church member said, well, Pastor, why don't you go and just talk to them? Why don't you go spend some time with them? And previously that pastor was like, I don't want to get involved in that. But he said, you know what, maybe that's a good idea. And so what he did, he went over and he started to spend time with his neighbor. He didn't drink or he didn't gamble, but he just hung out with them. He got to know them and just built a relationship with them. And eventually over time, he found that many of them were open to the gospel, and some even started attending his church. All right, so here's a pastor who is willing to adapt his life to become a servant to other people. Right? He's able to bridge those boundaries and to open doors for the sake of the gospel mission, for kingdom purposes. And Paul here is setting us an example that as we seek to share the gospel with other people, we need to be willing to not only lay down our rights, but be willing to open our lives in ways to overcome those bridges, those boundaries, and to cross bridges into their lives for the sake of the gospel. I've been thinking about how, as a church, what opportunities do we have to reach other people outside the church? And over the last few years, it's been hard for us to do a lot of that. We haven't had our church building. But now that we have our church here, we can do whatever we want. I've been thinking, we can't just expect people to come to us, right? We can't expect our primary way of reaching people is to say, hey, come to church Sunday morning, right? Because for a lot of people, that's a totally foreign concept to them. Maybe they never stepped foot in church their whole lives. And so for us as God's people, we need to be ready to go outside of our comfort zone to bridge those gaps, to bring the gospel to other people. It may involve us going to places where we're not completely comfortable. It may involve us doing things that maybe we're not used to doing. It may be involved interacting with people that we may not normally interact with. But Paul is challenging us here to become a servant to everyone. Not just the people like us, not just the people who come into church on Sunday morning, but to be able to cross those boundaries for the sake of the gospel. And we just heard about this missionary couple this morning who left their homes, who left the place where they grew up, who left their cities, who left their place of comfort, who left their jobs, to go to a foreign country, to learn a new language, to live in a different culture, to meet a new people they've never known, and maybe have nothing in common with. But why? It's for the sake of the gospel. They're called by God to be servants of the gospel and to do whatever it takes to bridge those gaps for the sake of the kingdom. And that calling is not just for missionaries who go overseas, but it's for each and every one of us. Are we willing to lay down our rights? Are we willing to lay down our comforts? Are we willing to lay down our own desires and plans for the sake of the gospel, as Paul did? Let's read on in verse 24. Paul says this, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize." All right, what is Paul saying here? He's saying that as believers, we need to keep our eyes focused on the mission. We need to keep our eyes focused on the mission. And here's using this picture of a runner training for a race. I know we have some runners training for races in our congregation, and they have to keep focus, right? They have to say that there's a race coming. I need to discipline myself. I need to discipline my body. I may need to change my diet. I might need to change my training schedule. I may need to rearrange my life. Why? For that one purpose of reaching the finish line, right? To not be able to just get there, but to run a good race. And Paul here is saying the same thing. He's saying, as believers, we're called to race, to seek the finish line, right? We're not just called to sit on the sidelines and be comfortable, but we're called to keep our eyes focused on the mission, right? To do whatever it takes to complete the mission that God has set for us. Even if it means laying down our rights, even if it means sacrificing ourselves, even if it means enduring difficulties and pain and suffering and self-discipline, Paul says, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I'll do whatever it takes for the sake of the gospel. I'll lay down my life for the kingdom. I'll do whatever God has called me to do. I'm willing to lay down my life because God has called me to do it. And we know that God doesn't just call us to become servants for our own sake. He doesn't call us just to lay down our lives, but he calls us to follow the example that Jesus set for us. Philippians 2 says, "In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant and being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father." Jesus set us an example of what it means to lay down our rights and to lay down our lives. Jesus could have come into this world like a king, like a powerful dictator. He could have elevated himself above pain and suffering, but he chose to lower himself. He chose to become like us, to lay aside his glory so that we can know Jesus and we could see God walking among us. So God calls us to receive the same challenge and the same invitation. Are we willing to lay down our rights, to lay down our lives for the sake of the kingdom? To say like Paul, that I'm ready to become a servant to all. I'm ready to go wherever you call me, to do whatever you want me to do. To be a church, to be the church that God has called us to be. A community of people united under one purpose. That we don't come to church just for ourselves, for our own happiness and fulfillment, but to be part of God's kingdom purpose. And we do so seeing that there's no sacrifice too great, no cost too high, no division or differences that will stand in our way, but to come together in unity, to lay down our lives in service to one another, and to build up the church of God so that others can know Jesus. That's the invitation that God has given to us, and that's the example that Jesus has set for us. I want to invite you this morning to say like Paul, I'm ready to run the race. I'm ready to follow where you lead. I'm ready to lay down my rights. And maybe there's some situations where God calls us to stand for our rights, but for the sake of the gospel, I believe that God calls us to lay down our rights if it's for a greater kingdom purpose. Let's bow our heads together. Let's take a minute just to reflect on God's word for us and to prepare our hearts for communion as we're about to celebrate that in a minute. Could I have the servers come forward? Let's take a few minutes to prepare our hearts.